Say that again.
Don't have time.
What?
I don't have time.
Oh.
I Love Lucy made Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz look like America's perfect couple. But behind the laughter was a marriage filled with infidelity, drinking, suspicion, and private investigators. Desi was allegedly living a double life, while Lucille was left trying to figure out where he really was when the cameras stopped rolling. And they weren't the only classic TV stars hiding shocking secrets. From beloved husbands to America's favorite neighbors, these 14 television icons were often nothing like the characters they played. And some of the stories ahead are far darker than anything they ever showed on television. Stay to the end. The final cases are genuinely disturbing. Number 1. Desi Arnaz, the faithful husband who wasn't. Let's start with the obvious one. Desi Arnaz co-created and co-starred in I Love Lucy, playing Ricky Ricardo, the devoted, occasionally exasperated, fundamentally loving husband opposite his real-life wife, Lucille Ball. The show was extraordinary. It genuinely was. It changed television. It made them both enormously famous and immensely wealthy. And behind the scenes, their marriage was falling systematically and deliberately apart from the very beginning, driven by Arnaz's escalating alcoholism and a pattern of infidelity that was so elaborate, so constant, and so openly conducted that it eventually required Lucille Ball to hire private detectives simply to track where her husband actually was on any given evening. The affair with actress Betty Grable was well documented and completely public among industry insiders. There were numerous other women. The drinking got worse. The arguments between them got louder and more frequent. And for over a decade, while the show grew more successful, while their production company Desilu became an industry powerhouse, while they were literally teaching America what a happy marriage looked like every single Thursday night, Lucille Ball was tolerating precisely none of this in private. According to their own daughter, Lucy Arnaz, there wasn't physical abuse in the household. She was quite specific about that distinction when she later discussed it publicly. But she was equally candid that the atmosphere inside their home was defined almost entirely by her father's alcoholism and his complete unwillingness to manage the most basic responsibilities of marriage. Desi himself acknowledged this, eventually. He did actually write about it in his own memoir. He admitted that the pressure of running Desilu, of being constantly compared to his far more famous wife, fed directly into his drinking. He remained, rather bewilderingly, genuinely surprised that Lucille Ball had simply run out of patience for it. By the time she filed for divorce in 1960, that patience had been utterly exhausted. Colleagues at Desilu, who survived that final period, described walking a careful line. You were trying to manage a production empire while both of its founding partners were privately unraveling their marriage. And the entire company, along with much of the viewing public, had a direct financial and emotional stake in believing that marriage was still happy. The two managed to remain business partners afterward. They actually remained friends, which is genuinely remarkable. But the gap between the affectionate, bumbling Ricky Ricardo audiences loved and the actual marriage falling apart behind the scenes was, by nearly every account, absolutely enormous. That's what I find genuinely chilling about this particular story. Not necessarily that Arnaz was unfaithful. Plenty of Hollywood figures have been. It's that the show was so specific about portraying exactly the kind of marriage he was actively destroying. Week after week, they performed marital harmony while living marital chaos. Number 2. Sid Caesar, the volatile genius. Sid Caesar dominated early television comedy. Your Show of Shows was the template. He had, working alongside him, Mel Brooks, Neil Simon, Carl Reiner. This was the writer's room that shaped American comedy for an entire generation. Behind the scenes, Caesar struggled with a temper that his colleagues described as genuinely frightening. It was fueled by escalating dependency on alcohol and pills that Caesar himself later admitted came directly from the crushing pressure and persistent insecurity of maintaining his success. The despair of needing to stay at the absolute top of what he was doing. He punched through walls during fits of rage. He tore sinks completely out of their fittings. The story that everyone knows, the one that became genuinely infamous, happened during a writing session when Caesar became so enraged at something that he dangled Mel Brooks, future auteur of countless brilliant films, out of an 18th floor hotel window. Brooks, remarkably, didn't hold a grudge. He actually cast Caesar in one of his own films later on. But that incident became the most infamous example of just how volatile a man could be once the cameras stopped rolling. Once the public persona evaporated, Caesar spoke candidly about this in his later years. He described the decades he spent battling addiction and rage, periods of despair that alternated with outbursts of anger he struggled to explain even to himself. Writers who worked in his room during the peak years described walking on eggshells, never entirely sure whether a given afternoon would end in some of the sharpest comedy that television had ever produced, or in Caesar completely tearing the room apart. Here's what's genuinely impressive, though. Caesar eventually sought treatment, and he spoke openly in his later years about all of it. That level of honesty is genuinely rare for entertainers of his generation. Few of them were willing to be that candid about their own worst behavior while they were still alive to discuss it. He credited that late-life honesty with repairing several relationships that his temper had damaged decades earlier. Though by his own admission, some of the harm done never fully healed. Some of those ruptures were permanent. What's interesting is that several of the writers who survived those volatile years in his room went on to become some of the most successful comedy voices in the decades that followed. More than one later said that surviving Caesar's temperament, however difficult it was, had genuinely sharpened their own instincts about what worked under genuine pressure. It's a complicated legacy, brilliance mixed with damage, genius paired with cruelty, and at the end, at least, some measure of regret. Number 3. Jackie Gleason, the bully with creative control. Jackie Gleason created The Honeymooners and played Ralph Craden, the blustery but ultimately soft-hearted bus driver who was somehow deeply, authentically lovable, despite his surface gruffness. It remains one of the most beloved sitcoms in television history. On his own set, Gleason ran things with an entirely different temperament. He had enormous creative control, and he used it to demand outsized salaries and perks that set him sharply and deliberately apart from and above the rest of his cast. Gleason rode in the longest limousine in town. His co-stars made do with far less. By most accounts, he was not universally admired. He was not even consistently liked by the people who worked closest to him. His reputation extended well beyond the show itself, as a demanding, sometimes intimidating presence. Those who worked with him over the years described a performer whose off-screen temperament rarely matched the warmth of the character that made him famous. Gleason initially resisted casting Audrey Meadows as his on-screen wife, worried she was simply too glamorous for the part. Meadows actually had to hire her own photographer to take deliberately unflattering pictures of herself just to convince him otherwise. That's the level of control we're discussing. He extended that control to nearly every corner of the production. Cast members who spent years working alongside him described a set where Gleason's mood on any given day completely dictated the atmosphere for everyone else. If he was feeling generous, the day moved smoothly. If he wasn't, everybody suffered. Gleason also insisted on filming most episodes in only 1 or 2 takes, which sounds efficient, until you realize that this demand left almost no room for actors to recover from a mistake without incurring his visible, undisguised irritation. Co-stars often said the pressure of knowing there would be no second chance shaped the entire rhythm of working alongside him. Art Carney, who played his best friend Ed Norton, reportedly developed his own health problems, partly attributed to the stress of working under such an unpredictable star for years on end. That detail rarely comes up alongside the show's reputation as one of the warmest, most beloved sitcoms of the entire decade. Number 4. William Frawley, the petty grudge that lasted decades. William Frawley played Fred Mertz on I Love Lucy, forming half of one of television's most genuinely beloved on-screen marriages, alongside Vivian Vance's Ethel. The reality behind the scenes was almost exactly the opposite. Frawley and Vance despised each other from their very first meeting, and the hatred only deepened over the course of the show's run. Frawley routinely referred to Vance using cruel, demeaning insults about her appearance. The two actors reportedly refused to speak to each other off camera unless they were reading directly from a script. Years after the show ended, when the two happened to be filming on adjacent studio lots, Frawley continued playing petty, mean-spirited tricks on his former co-star. He apparently carried that grudge and actively nursed it for the rest of his life, which, I have to say, is the pettiest possible interpretation of longevity. The feud apparently began the moment Vance learned she would be playing opposite an actor more than 20 years her senior. She apparently made some dismissive remarks about that age difference before they'd even filmed a single scene together, and Frawley never forgave her for it. Years later, when Frawley worked with child actors on My Three Sons, according to some accounts, he continued bringing up his hatred of Vance to colleagues on that set. This is a decade after I Love Lucy had ended. He was apparently unwilling to let the grudge fade. One account even describes Frawley enlisting some of the young cast members as informal allies in his ongoing vendetta against a woman they'd never even met. He was bad-mouthing Vivian Vance to children simply because the resentment had never once cooled in the years since their show together had ended. Despite the venom between them off-camera, both actors maintained enough professionalism that the on-screen chemistry of Fred and Ethel Mertz never once suffered. Which is genuinely strange. Biographers and fans alike have puzzled over that contradiction for decades. How two people who so thoroughly despised one another could nonetheless create some of the most touchingly believable domestic partnership television had ever produced. Number 5. Bob Crane. When the Secret Life Becomes a Crime Scene. Bob Crane starred as Colonel Hogan on Hogan's Heroes, a role that made him one of the most recognizable sitcom leads of the 1960s. He was charming. He was wisecracking. He was exactly the kind of light-hearted leading man that audiences absolutely adored. Behind that public image, Crane was living a genuinely disturbing secret life. He spent his free time picking up women and secretly filming graphic sexual encounters with them, often entirely without their knowledge or consent. He amassed an enormous private collection of these recordings and photographs over the years. Investigators later determined that a significant number of the women involved had no idea at the time that they were being taped at all. They learned about the recordings only after being contacted by police following Crane's death. Crane's double life became public only after his brutal, still unsolved murder in 1978. The revelations permanently reshaped how an entire generation of fans remembered a performer they'd previously known only as a light-hearted sitcom lead. Crane's own son later claimed publicly that all of the women involved had given their consent. Subsequent investigation contradicted that account entirely. It turned up numerous women who said they'd only learned of the recordings after being contacted by police. Friends and colleagues who knew Crane during his Hogan's Heroes years later admitted they'd had some awareness of his womanizing. Few had any real sense of the scale of the recording collection he'd built up. What might have remained a private, morally troubling hobby became one of true crime's most unsettling footnotes once it emerged alongside the details of his unsolved killing. Crane's murder was never solved. The sheer volume of disturbing material investigators uncovered meant the case became as much a story about his hidden private life as it was a genuine murder mystery. Number 6. Arthur Godfrey, the gatekeeping tyrant. Arthur Godfrey was one of the most powerful men on early television. He hosted multiple top-rated programs and controlled the careers of an entire roster of young performers who depended on his favor to keep working. He was, essentially, the gatekeeper to television success. In October of 1953, Godfrey publicly and abruptly fired singer Julius LaRosa live on the air. He informed his television audience of the firing before he'd even told LaRosa directly. all because the young singer had dared to hire his own manager. Godfrey framed the firing around La Rosa's supposed lack of humility. That justification struck much of the public as wildly disproportionate. It revealed just how much control Godfrey expected to maintain over performers who owed their careers to him. The incident badly damaged Godfrey's public reputation. It exposed a controlling, vindictive side of a man previously known only for his folksy, relaxed on-air persona. La Rosa's actual offense had simply been making a completely ordinary business decision, hiring a professional manager rather than negotiating directly with Godfrey himself. The backlash was severe enough that La Rosa, initially fired and publicly shamed, emerged from the incident with more public sympathy and career opportunities than Godfrey himself. Godfrey spent years afterward trying to repair a reputation that never fully recovered. Godfrey had built his entire career on a folksy, trustworthy persona, presenting himself as an honest, plain-spoken everyman rather than a powerful executive. That made the sheer pettiness of the La Rosa firing all the more jarring once the full story became public knowledge. Several other performers came forward afterward with their own stories of his controlling behavior. The La Rosa incident looked less like an isolated lapse and more like a rare public glimpse of a pattern that had existed for years. Godfrey's ratings and public standing never fully recovered to their earlier heights. Number 7. Jack Webb, the perfectionist who eliminated personality. Jack Webb created and starred in Dragnet, playing Detective Joe Friday with a famously flat, clipped delivery that became one of the most parodied styles in television history. Behind the camera, Webb ran his set with a punishing perfectionist intensity. He eliminated rehearsals entirely and forced actors to read their lines directly off cards to achieve the robotic, deadpan style he insisted upon. He had almost no patience for collaborators who couldn't match his demands. He fired his own original director in 1952, the moment he felt confident enough to take over directing duties himself. Colleagues who worked with him described a workaholic whose temper and exacting standards drove away anyone who couldn't match his relentless pace. Webb's insistence on stripping performances down to flat, emotionless delivery meant actors had almost no room to bring their own interpretation to a scene. Some colleagues found the approach genuinely stifling to work under for extended periods. Those who stuck with him for the long haul described a strange trade-off, enduring years of rigid control and a difficult temperament in exchange for being part of one of the most influential and commercially successful shows of the entire decade. Webb apparently kept a small, loyal circle of actors and crew who understood and tolerated his methods while constantly turning over the rest of his cast. This meant Dragnet's credits changed constantly, even as Webb himself remained the unmovable center of every episode. Those who did earn his trust often stayed with him across multiple different shows over the following decades, which suggests that, difficult as his temperament genuinely was, it came paired with a genuine loyalty toward the small circle of people who learned how to work within his system. Number 8. Ozzie Nelson, the puppeteer who controlled everything. Ozzie Nelson turned his real family into television's most wholesome sitcom household on the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, casting his actual wife and 2 sons alongside himself for a show that ran for 14 years. Behind the cameras, historians who examined the family's dynamic described a household defined by intense, tightly controlled pressure. Ozzie was writing, directing, and controlling nearly every aspect of both the show and his sons' real lives. According to biographer David Halberstam, the family maintained a carefully rehearsed public front of total harmony, even as the household experienced serious private battles that would completely disappear the moment an outsider walked through the door. Son Ricky Nelson was apparently desperate to escape his father's controlling shadow well into adulthood. That desperation never once made it onto the cheerful, carefully managed show that made the family famous. Ozzie wrote, produced, and directed nearly every episode himself. This meant there was almost no separation between his son's real adolescence and the fictional version broadcast into millions of homes each week. Both David and Ricky later described feeling as though their entire childhoods had effectively become company property. Ricky's real songwriting and musical career were folded directly into the show's storylines at their father's direction. This blurred any line between family life and the family business. Ricky Nelson struggled for years to be taken seriously as a musician independent of the wholesome image his father had built around him. That tension followed him well into his adult recording career. Biographers have noted that his eventual embrace of a rougher, more rebellious rock and roll sound was in part a direct reaction against the tightly controlled image Ozzie had spent over a decade constructing. David Nelson spoke more sparingly about the family dynamic in interviews, though he acknowledged that growing up under constant public and parental scrutiny left both brothers with complicated feelings about the show that made their entire family famous. Number 9. Robert Montgomery, the disapproving father. Robert Montgomery was a major star of both film and early television, hosting the popular anthology series Robert Montgomery Presents throughout the 1950s. His daughter, future bewitched star Elizabeth Montgomery, described her relationship with her father as one defined by emotional distance and a demanding, difficult-to-please man who required her to audition for roles on his own show, just like any other actress. Robert Montgomery was a staunch conservative figure who disapproved of his daughter's chosen career and personal choices for years. Biographers who studied the family described a lifelong unresolved tension that Elizabeth apparently carried into her own adult relationships. The warm, magical persona she brought to television screens as Samantha Stevens stood in sharp contrast to the cold, critical household she described growing up in. Her father's disapproval reportedly extended well beyond her career to her marriages and her more liberal political leanings, which stood in direct opposition to his staunch conservatism. Biographers have suggested that much of Elizabeth's later drive and independence came directly from spending a childhood trying, and often failing, to win the approval of a father who rarely offered it freely, even after she'd become one of the most famous faces on American television in her own right. Elizabeth apparently spent years trying to prove herself worthy of a career her father never fully endorsed. Colleagues who worked with her on Bewitched later said she brought a genuine, hard-won toughness to the set that seemed directly shaped by decades spent trying to win over an audience of one who was rarely satisfied, no matter how successful she became. Robert Montgomery died in 1981. By most accounts, the two never fully reconciled the underlying tension that had defined their relationship since Elizabeth's earliest years, trying to break into the same industry that had already made her father famous. Number 10. Jack Cassidy, the undiagnosed illness. Jack Cassidy was a celebrated Broadway and television performer, married for 18 years to actress and singer Shirley Jones, best known for her role on The Partridge Family. In her own memoir, Jones revealed that Cassidy struggled with undiagnosed bipolar disorder and severe alcoholism. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and disturbing as the years progressed. Jones described one particularly alarming incident in which she found her husband sitting naked in a corner of their home, calmly informing her that he now believed himself to be Christ. Cassidy was also repeatedly unfaithful throughout their marriage. Jones later confirmed he pursued relationships with men as well as women, a chaotic and often frightening reality that stayed almost entirely hidden from the public until she finally wrote about it decades later. Jones said she tolerated the affairs and volatility, partly out of genuine love, and partly because Cassidy's undiagnosed illness made it difficult for her to separate the man she'd married from the increasingly unpredictable behavior that came later. Cassidy died in a house fire in 1976, just a year after their divorce was finalized. He reportedly fell asleep with a lit cigarette after a night of heavy drinking, a tragic and eerily fitting end to a life that Jones later said had spiraled steadily out of control for years. In later interviews, Jones said she came to view her ex-husband with more compassion than anger. She recognized only in hindsight just how much of his behavior had likely been driven by an illness that went completely undiagnosed and untreated for the entirety of their marriage. Number 11. Carroll O'Connor, the difficult star. Carroll O'Connor became a television icon, playing the bigoted but strangely beloved Archie Bunker on All in the Family, one of the most influential sitcoms ever made. Behind the scenes, the show's creator and executive producer Norman Lear later described O'Connor bluntly as difficult and often abusive to work with. Lear added only that his performance as Archie made up for it. O'Connor went on strike during production over pay and vacation disputes. At one point, he actually sued the production company outright. He was reportedly so possessive of his character that he had a scene-stealing supporting actor's role written out of the show entirely, rather than share the spotlight. He was unwilling to let any other cast member draw laughs that he felt belonged to Archie Bunker alone. Lear described their working relationship as constantly stressful. That tension rarely showed through in the finished episodes, but it defined much of what actually happened on set week after week. O'Connor reportedly arrived at nearly every table read anxious and unhappy, regardless of how strong or weak that week's script actually was. This meant the tension on set was less about any single dispute and more a constant underlying feature of working alongside him. Lear nonetheless continued working with O'Connor for years afterward on multiple additional projects. He later attributed this decision simply to how rare O'Connor's talent genuinely was, difficult temperament notwithstanding. Crew members who worked on All in the Family for its full run often said that O'Connor's moods could shift the entire pace of a shoot day. Some episodes finished well ahead of schedule. Others stretched for hours longer than planned, depending entirely on how the star was feeling when he walked onto the set that morning. Number 12. Jerry Lewis, the egomaniac and bully. Jerry Lewis built one of the most successful careers in American comedy, first alongside Dean Martin and later as a solo star, filmmaker, and beloved host of the annual Labor Day telethon. Away from the stage, Lewis developed a reputation for explosive, sometimes frightening outbursts. He admitted in his own memoir to having been a bully and an egomaniac during the years his partnership with Martin fell apart. That rift kept the two men from speaking for decades. Lewis reportedly controlled co-stars with unusual rigidity. At one point, he forbade an entire cast from speaking to a young actress off-camera. His own children later described him as cold and cruel throughout their lives. The rift was severe enough that he ultimately cut several of them out of his will entirely before his death in 2017. Lewis was known throughout his career for insensitive public remarks about women and other groups. Those comments, combined with accounts from his own family, painted a picture sharply at odds with the beloved telethon host millions of viewers thought they knew each Labor Day. Lewis and Martin eventually reconciled decades later in a widely publicized on-air reunion. This moment softened some public perception of Lewis's temperament, though those closer to the situation have said the underlying tension between the two men and the behavior that caused the original rift was never fully resolved, even after the cameras captured their handshake. Lewis's estranged children spoke publicly after his death about years of trying and failing to repair their relationship with their father. They described a man whose public generosity through the telethon never seemed to translate into the same warmth at home. Number 13. Ed Sullivan, the vindictive gatekeeper. Ed Sullivan hosted the single most influential variety show of the entire television era. He personally introduced American audiences to everyone, from Elvis Presley to the Beatles. That level of cultural gatekeeping gave him enormous, largely unchecked power over which performers succeeded and which simply never got the exposure they needed. Behind his stiff, awkward on-air persona was a man widely known throughout the industry for holding grudges with genuine, career-ending consequences. When rock and roll pioneer Bo Diddley defied Sullivan's instructions during a live broadcast, Sullivan reportedly told him directly that he would never work in television again and made good on the threat by banning him from the show permanently. A similar fate met comedian Jackie Mason after an on-air dispute. The resulting lawsuit dragged on for years. Performers who crossed Sullivan even once often discovered just how much control he held over their careers. A level of quiet, vindictive power that rarely matched the friendly, awkward showman audiences saw introducing each week's acts. Sullivan's grudges reportedly extended well beyond the two most famous incidents. Numerous smaller acts over the years found themselves quietly blacklisted from the show after minor disputes that never became public at all. Because an appearance on his program could genuinely make or break a career during that era, performers throughout the industry understood that crossing Sullivan carried real professional risk, regardless of how mild-mannered he appeared each Sunday night on camera. Sullivan's power extended well beyond simply booking or blacklisting acts. A mention of disapproval from him in his own newspaper column could shape public opinion of a performer overnight, giving him influence over entertainers' careers that few other single individuals could match at any point during the era. Even major stars, who had already achieved significant fame elsewhere, generally treated a Sullivan appearance with real caution, aware that a single misstep on his stage could undo years of otherwise careful career management. Number 14. Milton Berle, the absent father. Milton Berle became known as Mr. Television for his massive early success, hosting the Texaco Star Theater, a show so popular it was widely credited with driving television set sales across the entire country. At home, his adopted son William later published a memoir detailing a childhood defined by his father's near-total absence and troubling lapses in judgment. The memoir included Berle's decision to hire a prostitute for his son when the boy was only 16 years old. William Berle also described his father speaking at his own late wife's memorial service without once mentioning her name. Instead, he chose to tell jokes to the assembled mourners at his own wife's funeral. That's the decision he made. Milton Berle's response to his son's memoir was to cut off contact with him permanently for the rest of his life. A decision that tells you everything you need to know about a relationship that had clearly been strained long before either man ever spoke about it publicly. The memoir also detailed Berle's extensive and well-documented infidelity throughout his marriages, along with a lifelong gambling habit that ran alongside the emotional distance his son described experiencing growing up. For a performer whose entire public persona was built around warmth, mass appeal, and being the affable face that helped sell an entire generation of American households on owning a television set, the private account his own son eventually published painted a strikingly different picture of the man behind Uncle Milty. Berle never publicly disputed the specific claims in his son's memoir in any detail. He chose silence and estrangement over any kind of rebuttal. Many who followed the story took that response as a tacit confirmation of just how much truth the uncomfortable account actually contained. William Berle continued speaking about his father in interviews after the memoir's release, describing a complicated mixture of resentment and lingering hope for a reconciliation that never ultimately came before Milton Berle's death in 2002. 14 different stars, 14 different shows, 14 very different reasons why the person audiences saw on screen turned out to be nothing like the person waiting behind the camera. Some of these stories involve genuine cruelty toward colleagues and family. A couple involve behavior that crossed clearly into criminal territory. And what all 14 have in common is a television industry that spent decades selling audiences comfort and warmth. Built, in more cases than anyone probably wants to admit, on top of people who saved almost none of that warmth for the people who actually had to live or work alongside them. None of this erases what any of these 14 accomplished on screen. Several of them remain genuinely beloved decades after their shows first aired, still rerun nightly in living rooms that have absolutely no idea what actually went on once production wrapped for the day. What it does complicate is the easy nostalgia so often attached to the earliest decades of American television. A golden era built, in case after case, on the backs of colleagues, spouses, and children who rarely got the chance to tell their side of the story until long after the cameras had already stopped rolling for good. Most of these stories only came fully into public view through memoirs, biographies, and interviews given decades after the shows themselves had ended. Long after the people directly affected had finally found enough distance or enough courage to speak openly about what the cheerful reruns, still airing every single day, never once showed. If you made it this far, subscribe. Genuinely. The algorithm doesn't do us any favors. And the only reason this channel survives is because people actually hit that button.